Hi, guys, and fellow Outlanderinos. I don't think that's a word, but I guess it is now. I'm Megan, and I guess I'm the one that started this book club. So this is week one of book one, Outlander, of the Outlander series. Yay! And I wanted to do like a quick recap of kind of what happened in each of the chapters that we read because there's so much going on in each of these chapters, and there's so much setup for the rest of the book in these chapters that I thought maybe a quick recap would be handy. But then when I started like typing it out, like there's a lot of stuff, and I thought, maybe I'll just make a video and that would be easier. I've also got some questions I'll read the questions here, but I will also post them in the first comment below this so that you all can, so that you have them for reference. You're not required. Look, guys, this is super, not, this is chill. Don't feel like you have to answer the questions. They're just kind of there to, jumpstart conversation. Some of the chapters are a little dry, they get a little long, and so it's just kind of a way to kind of get started. But if there's something that you really want to discuss, go for it. I'm not going to tell you no. I think the only thing that I would like us to watch out for, and I know most of us have read the books at least once, or at least this book anyway, at least once, but I think for those of us who maybe haven't made it all the way through the series, it would be a good habit to get into to try to refrain from spoilers if we can, especially since, there's things set up in this book that we find out more about later in the next books or later books. And for people who haven't made it to those books yet, I'd hate for us to kind of ruin the surprise. So just kind of be cognizant of that. But what am I going to do if you reveal a major spoiler, kick you out? I don't have that kind of power. So, just, or, tag something with a spoiler tag if it's something that you just really want to discuss or something like that so that people know to avoid it. So anyway, let me get situated here. Okay. So we did chapters 1 through 5 this week, which, covered all of the first part 1, which not all of it, half of it takes place in 1945 in Inverness. So chapter 1, A New Beginning, and I'm just going to kind of read through some of the notes that I wrote to myself at the end of the chapter. Okay, so quick recap. So chapter 1, we meet Frank and Claire. They're in Inverness on kind of a second honeymoon right after World War II. They got married and then promptly the war started and they haven't seen each other in 6 years or something like that. They've kind of been leading their own lives. Frank's been off in the war working with MI6. Claire's been a nurse. So, I get the impression they didn't get to much opportunity to see each other during the war itself. But now the war's over. Frank is going to take over a position at Oxford, and Claire and he are going on this second honeymoon before he takes over his, faculty position. And Claire has taken up botany as something to kind of do after the war. I kind of get the impression that her plans are to just kind of be the housewife. And botany is just kind of a nice, safe, respectable thing for women to do. They are trying to get pregnant and they are not having any luck, not from lack of trying. And you kind of read on and you find out that Claire had this kind of unorthodox upbringing. She was orphaned at an early age when she was 5, and went to live with her, went into custody of her uncle, who was an archaeologist. And so she spent a lot of time traveling the world with him. She learned to do things that aren't not necessarily ladylike, dig latrines and live in tents and, do these things that were not common for women to necessarily do back in this time. But the interesting thing is that had she not had this kind of upbringing, she wouldn't have met Frank, because that's how she met Frank. So, kind of the big thing that happens in this chat, like the big thing that happens in this chapter, is that Frank goes to see Mr. Bainbridge, who I think is a solicitor. I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember. And on his way home, it's storming, and Claire's up in the room, and she's lit these candles because the power's gone out. And he sees what he thinks is a ghost. And it's a tall Scotsman dressed in formal, like, the whole Highland regalia with the kilt and everything. And he tries to speak to him, but he doesn't. The ghost, or the whatever he is, walks away, but he is clearly watching Claire. And from the description, it sounds like this entity is Jamie, but we don't know that for a fact. And then, so he comes back in, and he and Claire are talking about this, and this brings about this interesting conversation about fidelity. And Frank says, kind of insinuates that, well, I know we've been apart for 6 years, and if something happened while during the war, I would totally understand, and, I would forgive you, and I would never be able to leave you because I love you, and, and Claire gets really offended at this, and she's like, how dare you even suggest that I've been unfaithful? But then at the end of the chapter, she thinks, well, it's not just me that's been apart from him for 6 years, it's been him that's apart from me for 6 years. How do I know that he's been faithful this whole time? Kind of an interesting way to leave the chapter. So, chapter 1. Chapter 2, Standing Stones. So Claire goes off with this little gentleman from the village named Mr. Crook, and he takes her out to kind of learn about the local wildflowers and kind of their medicinal purposes and where they grow and what they look like, as, hey, botany. And while they're out, they stop and they have lunch at the base of the hill that leads up to Craig Nadoon. So she's learned about this, and then she gets back and she sees Frank, and they go and visit the vicar. And this is where we meet Reverend Wakefield and his son, Roger, who is not really his son, who is also an orphan. He was the son of Reverend Wakefield's niece, who she died during the Blitz, and her husband died during the war. And so Frank and Reverend Wakefield are in their element, and they're doing all this research on Black Jack Randall. And it's kind of clear from the conversation that they're having that they know about him. He's a fairly well-documented individual because of who he was. But they don't really know about him. Does that make sense? Like, they don't really know about him. And so they really have no idea of just how awful Black Jack Randall really is. And we don't really either at this point. Frank just kind of says, well, there's evidence that he had all of these accusations brought against him, but they just kind of got, disappeared and got shoved off to the side, and nothing ever came of them. And then, he got all of these, acclamations from, the Duke of Sandringham and all these people. And, it's kind of this whole, well, how bad could he be if he's getting, first of all, nothing ever came of these accusations that were brought against him, right? And then, how bad can he possibly be, right? So anyway, so while this is going on, Claire's like, I don't care about all this. And she goes over and she has tea with Mrs. Graham, Reverend Wakefield's housekeeper. And while she's having tea, Mrs. Graham reads her tea leaves and reads her palm and kind of says, things are kind of weird. I can't, you have two marriage lines, which, indicates two husbands, but it forks. I don't understand how it all works, but she kind of insinuates that Claire's like a bigamist. And Claire's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And she kind of tries to ask how many kids am I going to have? And she's like, well, we can't really tell that, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so they get back. So Claire and Frank get back to their bed and breakfast, I guess. And she remembers that she wanted to tell him about Craig Nadoon, and he's like, oh, I totally want to see it. And they get up early and they go see the witches, I guess, call the sun for the festival. And it's really cool. And Claire sees this flower that she's like, oh, I want to see it. And she doesn't get a chance to. So she decides that she's going to go back the next day and check it out. She goes alone. And while she's there, she's checking out this flower. And then all of a sudden she falls through the stones. And that's the end of that chapter. Okay. So chapter 3 is The Man in the Wood. And so, hold on, turning my back into the chapter, which is a very long chapter, by the way. Okay, yeah, and I have a lot written down. So Claire lands in the past, but at first she thinks that the people that she's seeing are actors, like filming a movie or something. And so she's kind of trying to avoid getting like interrupting filming. And she encounters a man who she initially thinks is Frank because he looks so much like Frank, but it turns out it is not Frank. It is Black Jack Randall. And so she's been in the past for all of like 10 minutes and he's already trying to sexually assault her. So that's, great. So she's rescued by Murtaugh, who delivers her to Dougal. I'm not sure that her rescue from Black Jack is any less traumatic than than the first encounter with Black Jack. Like, it all just seems to be very traumatic. Anyway, so he takes her to Dougal, and Dougal is kind of hiding out in this cottage with his men, and they don't really know what to make of her. She's not dressed at all like she should be dressed. At first, they think that she's basically a sex worker, and it's just, they're kind of trying to figure out what to do with her. They're kind of looking at her like, well, maybe we're gonna sexually assault you ourselves. And Dougal's like, nope, we don't have time for that. And she's like, well, thank God for small wins, right? So they decide that they're going to move on, and that they're going to take her with them because they don't really know what else to do with her. And that's when we meet Jamie for the first time. And Jamie is sitting over by the fire, and he's clearly been injured. He's bleeding because I feel like Jamie is always bleeding or injured. And so they're come to find out his shoulder is dislocated, and they're trying to put it back in joint, and she's like, stop, you're gonna break his arm. So she takes over and puts his shoulder back in joint and bandages his gunshot wound, basically. And they take off, and they don't really know where they're going. Or she doesn't really know where she's going, and she asks Jamie, and Jamie's like, I don't know where we're going either. And as they're riding off, they encounter an English watch, and they engage them. But Claire kind of gets shoved off the horse. And she kind of uses this opportunity as, like, a chance to escape. But then she realizes that something is not right. Like, as if, like, she's been putting things together slowly. Like, there's no electricity in the cottage. There's no running water in the cottage. There's, people are dressed oddly. People are firing muskets at each other, and who uses a musket anymore? And those kinds of things. She's slowly, like, putting these things together. But she tries to escape, and she's like, I know where I am. I should be only about 3 miles from Inverness. I should be able to see the lights of the city, and I don't see any lights. And she realizes this is unusual by 20th century standards. So she kind of realizes at this point that she's not in Kansas anymore. So she's kind of standing there, and Jamie collects her, and they return to the men. But shortly thereafter, Jamie collapses because, lo and behold, he's been stabbed by a bayonet. So Claire once again administers medical attention to him, and demonstrates her prowess with not only medicine but profanity, which is very shocking to the men. And then, despite her protestations, they continue on down the road to who knows where. So chapter 4, I come to the castle. So we finally find out where they're going. They are going to Castle Leoch, and we meet Mrs. Fitz, who seems to be like this very sweet kind of kindred spirit to Claire. She's knowledgeable about medicinal herbs and their uses. And so between Mrs. Fitz and Claire, they begin to kind of doctor Jamie, who's looking a bit worse for wear. But Mrs. Fitz has a lot to do, so she just kind of leaves Claire to deal with Jamie. And Claire is still in inappropriate clothing at this point. So during the course of her treatment of Jamie, she discovers that he's got all of these scars on his back from where he has been flogged. And she just flat out asks him, "What'd you get flogged for?" And he goes into the whole story about how he was arrested and taken to Fort William. And at Fort William, he was flogged not once but twice by Black Jack Randall. And the whole reason that goes into it. And so at one point, Claire muses that her own impressions and the stories of Black Jack that she's hearing from the people in this time don't seem to jive with the accounts that she's heard of him through Frank's research. So it's kind of interesting how the information, the portrayal of Black Jack Randall that got passed down through history to Frank is not necessarily an accurate reflection of the person that Black Jack Randall really was. So after completing her ministrations, she kind of has this meltdown and starts crying, and it's been stressful. And I mean, if I found out I'd been thrown 200 years back into the past, I would probably kind of lose my shit too. And she tells Jamie that she's a widow, more or less because she just doesn't know what else to call herself. And he's comforting her in this kind of stereotypical romantic fashion, but they both kind of become aware that Jamie is physically interested in her as well. And so they break apart in this kind of also stereotypical awkwardness. And they both eat something and they feel better and then go to bed. And then that brings us to chapter 5, the last chapter, which is called The Mackenzie. And it's actually a very short chapter. So Claire is awakened by Mrs. Fitz, who is like, "Girl, you got to get up and we got to put you in some appropriate clothing because what you're wearing is not going to work." And she's like, "Why do I need to get up?" She doesn't really say that, but she's like, "Well, where am I going?" And she's like, "Well, you're going to go see the Mackenzie." And she's like, "Who's the Mackenzie?" But she kind of puts 2 and 2 together and she figures it out. So she's taken to meet the Mackenzie, who turns out to be Colin Mackenzie, who is chieftain of the clan, who is Dougal's older brother. And when she meets him, she realizes that his lower legs are deformed. And she doesn't really know why yet, but she recognizes that he's short. He only comes to about her shoulder. And so he just basically asked her how she came to be wandering alone in the woods in naught but her skivvies, which is how I wrote it, because it was late. And she tells him mostly the truth, but not the whole truth. Because, I mean, what's she going to say? By the way, I'm from 1945, and I walked through the stones at Craignadoon, and that's just, and hello, here I am. I mean, like, who's going to believe that, really? So when he leaves her to retrieve food, she finds a letter in his desk and discovers that it's April of 1743. And so she kind of has a rough idea of where she is in time. So Colin returns and makes it clear that he doesn't entirely believe her story, but until he has evidence to the contrary, she's welcome to remain at Leoch. It's not really an invitation to stay. It's more of a, we're not letting you leave until we know. I mean, we're not like throwing you into the dungeon, but we want to keep our eye on you kind of thing. And so that brings us to the end of part 1 and into part 2, which is called Castle Leoch. And that will be, of course, next week's. Those 5 chapters that make up part 2 will be next week's chapters. And I will put those in the comments below as well. Okay, so questions I have written down. So, question number 1, knowing that Captain Jack is related to Frank, does that change your opinion of Frank, and in what ways? And do you think that cruelty is in Frank's blood, so to speak? And kind of on the heels of that, do we tend to romanticize our ancestors a little bit? I don't know how much genealogy you all have done or have other people have done on your family trees. Parts of my family tree are really well documented, one of which goes way, way, way back. And we have the first Duke of Normandy, who was actually a Viking in our family. Anyway. But I mean, do we have a tendency to kind of romanticize these people without really knowing who they were? I mean, the Vikings were vicious. We know that. Like, that's not a secret. And the reason, and actually, strangely enough, the reason why this particular guy became the first Duke of Normandy is because he was already raiding the area, and the king of France was like, well, how about I just give you the area and you protect it for me? And he was like, sure, I can do that. And that's how he became the first Duke of Normandy. So it's kind of if you can't beat him, join him kind of thing. Anyway, so, do we tend to kind of ignore some of the less desirable traits in our ancestors? Just thinking. Okay, number 2. All marriages have strain. What possible trouble do you see in Frank and Claire's during their second honeymoon? How significant do you think those tensions would have become had Claire not inadvertently disappeared through the stones? And at this point, how sympathetic a figure do you find Frank to be? I think one of the other than the infidelity discussion that they had at the end of chapter 1, there's one later that I forgot to mention, which happens as they're leaving the Reverend Wakefield's house. And, Claire says, there are a lot of orphans after the war, and, maybe we should just adopt an orphan. And Frank says, no. And he says, I don't think that I could love a child who wasn't my own, basically is what he's getting at. And that kind of shuts down that conversation. Anyway, so, how significant do you think these tensions would have become? Number 4, when Claire meets Dougal and his men, the scene is almost cinematic. It builds very slowly as the men kind of puzzle over Claire's identity and her odd clothing. We don't really see Jamie for several pages. And then when this scene builds to its climax, Claire takes charge of the situation and the men listen. And this is kind of the first episode in which we see 2 kind of recurring conflicts. The first is between the 20th century scientific medical practices and 18th century assumptions, or how they kind of treated injuries and wounds and stuff like that. And the second is the conflict between a modern educated woman's expectation that she be taken seriously and the tendency of 18th century men to assume that she was merely like a sex worker or otherwise insignificant. So what accounts for the men's willingness to recognize, at least temporarily, her authority in this situation? Was it Claire? Was it just their concern over Jamie's injuries? Like, why all of a sudden did they sit up and listen? And then the last question is, after the skirmish at Cocknammon Rock, Jamie faints from his wounds. And not only does this allow Claire to further demonstrate her medical skill, but it introduces an interesting gender role reversal and undermines this sort of formulaic conventions of romance novels that we have. We expect our female protagonists to kind of faint in this pretty manner. I mean, I'm pretty sure even Scarlett O'Hara fainted at some point in Gone with the Wind. But we don't expect our young warriors to faint from blood loss. So how does this affect your initial impressions of Jamie? who we're just kind of starting to get to know in the books at this point. So those are my questions. And again, I will post them in the first comment below, as well as the reading for next week. And anyway, we'll see how it goes. And I'm excited to see what you all have to think, or what you all have to say. Otherwise, everybody have a great week, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.